Happy Monday, everyone. This is Martha with Nature Niche. I'm coming to you on location from the Wild Gardens of Acadia in Acadia National Park. And they are about a dozen, they have about a dozen of the native ecosystems that you can see in the park, all out and demonstrated in miniature. And for all the native plant enthusiasts out there, it's been a great walk through the garden, and I wanted to share some of the highlights with you. So the Wild Gardens of Acadia is a great stop in the northeast quadrant of the Park Loop Road. And I highly recommend exploring it before doing much of your hiking excursions, because it really helps you get a sense of the native flora and habitats within the park. It's located at the trailheads for the Sur de Mont Spring and the Nature Center there, and also trailheads to the Great Meadow. These gardens are dedicated to displaying, preserving, and propagating the native flora of Acadia National Park, and it really has a long history dating back to the early 1900s. And then they began purposefully growing and displaying native plants in the 1960s with the help of many organizations like local garden clubs, other garden volunteers, county master gardener, and state master naturalist programs. And now there are over 400 indigenous plant species that are established with 13 habitat areas. So they've grouped the plants by habitat characteristics. This set of gardens has won numerous awards, and now it's an official committee of the Friends of Acadia in partnership with Acadia National Park. It's still maintained primarily by volunteers, with the help of a head gardener and summer intern through the Friends of Acadia National Park. And the goal is to enhance the public's understanding of native plants and their habitats, and fostering a sense of their stewardship. So let's take a look at some of these areas. One of the largest and one of the first habitat types you come to is called the mixed woods. And this is a transitional forest that has both deciduous hardwoods, especially where there's richer soil and warmer microclimate, but you also get the more northern coniferous forest species, those evergreen trees that can tolerate more acidic, cooler soil and fewer nutrients. So they're mixed deciduous and coniferous trees. And these woods tend to develop on loose glacial till where the terrain is relatively gentle. And these species might include white pine, eastern hemlock, northern red oak, American beech, sugar maple, red maple, yellow birch, American elm. One of my favorite parts was the fern path. And so many different species of ferns to see. Everything has a sign. It is a plant enthusiast dream to stroll through here and see all of the labeled native plants. So ferns are pretty sensitive to soil moisture and nutrients, and so the fern path is a great place to kind of check out those different species that you might be more spread out in the landscape across different nutrient and moisture gradients. Another habitat type they have is called roadside. And so these are plants that prefer sunny, disturbed areas. So you'll see them along the various roads and carriage roads in the national park. And so there are lots of species of brambles in the genus Rubus. You'll recognize a couple here that we have in Michigan. And goldenrods, hawthorn, shadbush, and viburnums. A lot of times these areas have invasive species. They manage those very closely in the gardens. But here's a cool look at a state endangered goldenrod in Michigan. So that's the fun part about going to a different state. Sometimes what's common there is actually quite rare in the state you're from. So silverrod is a white goldenrod species that is known from dry open woods, was last seen in the 1800s, and was recently rediscovered in southeast Michigan. Another habitat type are meadows. And so that in coastal Maine, those are kept open only through disturbance. So fire, flooding from beaver activity, the scouring action of river floodwaters and ice, and human intervention. So otherwise the meadows would succeed to woody plants and become forests. So you get a lot of neat small plants like strawberries and violets and the pussy toes we see here, things that love sunny areas. And oftentimes these areas are damp, but you also have larger, later blooming species like dogbane and fireweed, groundsel, roses, and meadowsweet. They look lovely in late summer. It was very fantastic to see the goldenrods and asters blooming. So another large part of the gardens is dedicated to the habitat type of coniferous woods, which is very typical when folks think of Maine. So you have the lichen-clad red spruce, white spruce, and balsam fir along the coastal rocks, growing in very thin soil over those rocky shores. And often these trees are really shorn by the harsh winds. And these plants have to deal with fog and salt spray, and you also get larger cone-bearing trees in these habitats, including white pine, red pine, and eastern hemlock, as well as some hardwood tree species. And this is part of the vast northern spruce fir forest. In the understory, you see species like mountain laurel and partridge berry, great acidic indicating ground cover species. I also got to see some asters, a familiar dry shade species, big leaf aster, as well as learning a new one that we don't have in Michigan, world aster. I got to see another state listed species. This is hay-scented fern. It is state endangered in Michigan, known from part sun to full sun, kind of dry, acidic soil sites and rock outcrops. And they had it here in the garden as well. The far corner of the garden has 3 different aquatic habitats, including marsh, a pond, and a bog area. So the marsh area is a shallow wetland area with emergent vegetation, and they're adapted to growing in that inundated soil conditions. And this one has a stream flowing through it, and they're having trouble keeping some of the vegetation along the bank because they have beavers swimming up the stream, getting like through a culvert into the fenced garden and eating some of the plants. They've had to fence off certain species from the beavers. So the marsh area has kind of mucky soils, and you'll see species like sedges and bunkbean, St. John's wort, blue flag iris. I saw cardinal flower and boneset and jewelweed, as well as bristly or swamp rose. The more open water, kind of deeper inundation area had some nice water lilies and pickerelweed, horsetail and cattail, water willow and boneset, and along the banks, shrub species like sweet gale and steeplebush. The bog area, in Acadia, the bogs are lined with clay that was deposited during the last ice age. And while they are wetland systems, they tend to have little water flowing through them, unlike marshes and swamps, other kinds of wetland systems. They are fed mostly by rain, and you get only partial decomposition of plants, and the water is acidic. And with that acidity and lack of oxygen, it's really tough for bacteria to break down that plant material. So you get the formation of plant debris building up as peat, and you'll get some really cool acid-loving plants. Now at the garden, they're struggling because of beaver activity, and maybe some other development things going on. They have increased flooding, and so it's really hard to keep the conditions right for those acid-loving plants. So they had a nice little acidic plant display in pots, things like pitcher plant and sundew. They had large cranberry and other acidic plants. And there's so much flooding you can't actually access the whole bog area right now on foot. They also feature a brookside habitat, so basically a stream, riparian habitat where you have a lot of vines and trees kind of all competing for the sunlight out at the edge of the water. And that had a lot of ferns and sedges and plants like this prairie willow fenced off from the hungry beavers. The heath habitat is characterized by poor, sandy, acidic soils. So you have things in the heath family or ericaceae family. So blueberries and huckleberry, rhodora, species like that. The beach habitats in Acadia National Park are quite variable, from granite and shell-derived sands to large cobbles, tumbled and rounded by the crashing waves. And you'll get plants that are tolerant of salt spray and wind and occasional inundation during storms. And to be able to pull off this habitat in the gardens, they have introduced seaweed and actual beach gravel to help support those plants. So you'll see things like roseroot sedum, Arctic blue flag iris, and beach peas, lovage, skullcap, silverweed, and some beach grasses. They also had seaside goldenrod, which is actually becoming invasive in Michigan along the salty roadsides. It's not native for us. And the New York aster was so lovely along Sand Beach. As I discussed a couple weeks ago, the mountain habitat has a lot of steep, exposed bedrock, and the plants there are subject to wind and rain, gravity washing soil, and the hard granitic bedrock that doesn't decompose readily. So thin soils, harsh conditions for plants to grow in. So you get a lot of small plants, low shrubs, and really stunted trees. Tiny spleenwort ferns, black crowberry, which is state threatened in Michigan, three-toothed cinquefoil, bearberry, and columbine, blueberry, juniper, and bare oak. The pitch pine upland habitat is dry and open, so you'll find pitch pines on south and west facing slopes, also in old quarries on Mount Desert Island. It is Acadia's only pine that has needles in bundles of 3. You'll also find shrubs like huckleberry and shadbush, bush honeysuckle, sweet fern, and chokeberry. But fire is really important in this type of woodland, and that's something that pitch pines are well adapted to. They can resprout after fire, and it kind of gives them this natural bonsai shape. The last habitat highlighted at the gardens is a bird thicket. So it's a shrub dominated type of system, and they feature native plants that have food resources for birds and other wildlife, like buds and nectar, fleshy fruits, dry seeds, and insects that feed on those plants. And so the structural diversity there helps provide nesting sites for birds at different levels, and just a great place for edge species to thrive. With that, I hope you've enjoyed the fall color and diversity of native plants in this tour of the Wild Gardens of Acadia. I wish every national park had such a great educational resource to help orient the public to a place's unique vegetation and habitats. If you're visiting Acadia National Park, don't miss it. Do this first. Take care and have a good week.